at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, April 7th, 2026. President Donald Trump posted 7 words on Truth Social that shook the world. A whole civilization will end tonight. He was referring to Iran, and he had set a precise deadline of 8 p.m. In just 90 minutes, he threatened to destroy every bridge, every power plant, every piece of critical infrastructure in a nation of 90 million people. The announcement sparked panic, outrage, and a flurry of unprecedented global reactions. Iranian civilians rushed to form human chains around power plants, desperate to shield them. The Pope from Castel Gandolfo warned that this would constitute a war crime. Democrats in Washington called for the invocation of the 25th Amendment. Even some Republicans broke ranks, expressing alarm at the president's unprecedented threat. Then, at 6:28 p.m., just 90 minutes before the so-called deadline, everything changed. Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire. The market reacted immediately. Oil prices plummeted 19% in hours, marking the single largest one-day drop in almost 6 years. Dow futures jumped over 1,000 points. Asian markets soared, with Japan's Nikkei surging nearly 5% and South Korea's Kospi rising almost 7%. For a moment, it seemed as though the worst energy crisis since the 1970s might finally be subsiding. But beneath the headlines and market rallies, the reality is far more fragile. This ceasefire is conditional, precarious, and far from resolving the underlying crisis. Iran insists the Strait of Hormuz will reopen, but only under Iranian military coordination. The United States has yet to accept Iran's 1-0-point peace proposal, and analysts warn that even under ideal circumstances, it could take months to clear the backlog of over 2,000 ships stranded in the Persian Gulf. The next 14 days will determine whether this is the start of peace or merely a temporary pause before a far greater escalation. To truly understand the ceasefire, we must go back to what led to it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated strike campaign against Iran that shattered conventional expectations of modern warfare. Within hours, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed, alongside dozens of senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders, nuclear scientists, and military officials. The opening strike was devastating, unprecedented in scope, and fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Iran retaliated immediately. Missiles and drones targeted Israel, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. American bases across the region came under sustained attack. Hezbollah reignited conflict in Lebanon, and Iran took the decisive step of effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow but critically strategic waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. In peacetime, 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows through this passage, roughly 15 million barrels of crude oil and 5 million barrels of refined products each day. By early March, vessel traffic through the strait collapsed from 138 ships per day to mere single digits, a 94% reduction. The International Energy Agency described it as the largest supply disruption in modern energy market history. The human cost of this conflict has been staggering. According to US-based human rights organization RANA, at least 3,597 people have died in Iran alone, including 1,665 civilians, 1,221 military personnel, and 711 unclassified casualties. Over 26,500 people have been injured, according to the Iranian Health Ministry. Lebanon has seen at least 100 deaths since Israel launched ground operations against Hezbollah on March 2nd. In Israel, Iranian missile and drone attacks have killed 26 civilians and wounded over 7,000 more. 13 American service members have been killed, with 303 injured, primarily from traumatic brain injuries caused by Iranian ballistic missiles targeting U.S. bases. Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and other nations have also reported casualties. The scale of destruction extends beyond human lives to infrastructure. In Iran, over 120 historical sites have been damaged, according to the BBC. Sharif University of Technology was bombed, and the century-old Pasteur Institute Medical Center suffered heavy damage. Residential areas, schools, hospitals, and cultural heritage sites have all been hit. On April 2nd, American airstrikes destroyed the B-1 bridge between Throne and Karage, considered the highest bridge in the Middle East. 8 people were killed and 95 wounded, many of whom were celebrating the Persian holiday Sizdah Bedar below the bridge. The devastation of 39 days of war, thousands dead, and trillions in economic losses set the stage for one of the most dramatic political moments in recent history. On Easter Sunday, April 6th, President Trump posted a message on Truth Social that shocked even his closest allies. Open the strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. The next morning, he escalated his rhetoric further, threatening, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. The threat of deliberately destroying civilian infrastructure, which tens of millions depend on, is a war crime under international law, including the Geneva Conventions and the Pentagon's Law of War Manual. Democrats responded with fury. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeff called Trump unhinged, stating that his threat shocks the conscience. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, alongside other Democratic committee leaders, issued a joint statement condemning such attacks as morally unacceptable and legally impermissible. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi went further, highlighting the president's instability and calling for the invocation of the 25th Amendment. Even former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, once a staunch Trump loyalist, denounced the threat as evil and madness. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope, appealed for peace, urging the rejection of war that risks the destruction of countless innocent lives. Some Republicans, including Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, expressed concern, hoping that Trump's statements were bluster rather than prelude to real attacks. In Iran, the response was defiant. Citizens formed human chains around power plants, as called for by government officials, signaling their willingness to protect critical infrastructure at all costs. Iranian state media broadcast these efforts widely. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Bakai stated that Americans had attempted intimidation for 48 years and Iranians would not yield to arbitrary deadlines. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif was actively mediating between Washington and Tehran. Vice President J.D. Vance served as the U.S. interlocutor. At approximately 6 p.m., Sharif posted on social media urging Trump to extend the deadline by 2 weeks and requesting that Iran open the Strait of Hormuz temporarily as a gesture of goodwill. Then, at 6:28 p.m., just 90 minutes before the deadline, Trump posted again. Based on conversations with Prime Minister Sharif and Field Marshal Assam Munar of Pakistan, I agree to suspend the bombing and attack of Iran for a period of 2 weeks, conditional on Iran agreeing to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. But the details of this ceasefire are complex and conditional. From the U.S. perspective, Trump announced the suspension of attacks for 2 weeks and noted that the U.S. had received Iran's 10-point proposal, which he called a workable basis for negotiation. The two sides reportedly agreed on most points of contention. From Iran's side, the Supreme National Security Council announced acceptance of a 2-week ceasefire Foreign Minister Abbas Iraqi emphasized that if attacks ceased, Iranian forces would stop defensive operations. Yet, Iran's stipulations included reopening the Strait of Hormuz only under Iranian military coordination, with technical limitations applied to all maritime traffic, a significant departure from pre-war norms when over 100 vessels passed daily. Iran's 10-point proposal contains additional demands that the United States has not accepted, including the end of U.S. military operations across the region, the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, payment for war damages, and the continuation of uranium enrichment programs. Complications remain. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu supports the ceasefire, but insists that it does not cover Lebanon, where Israeli ground forces are still engaged with Hezbollah. Pakistan asserts the ceasefire is immediate and includes Lebanon. The U.S. military has halted offensive operations, yet the fundamental disagreements persist. Talks are scheduled to begin on Friday, April 10th in Islamabad, using Iran's 1 0-point proposal and the U.S. 1 5-point plan as negotiating bases. The U.S. plan reportedly called for a 30-day ceasefire, dismantling nuclear facilities, missile limitations, and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for lifting sanctions and supporting Iran's nuclear power infrastructure. Iran rejected this proposal, deeming it maximalist and unreasonable. The market reaction to the ceasefire was immediate and intense. West Texas Intermediate crude futures dropped nearly 19% below $95 per barrel. Brent crude fell almost 14%, around $94 per barrel, marking one of the largest single-day drops in oil prices in almost 6 years. U.S. stock futures surged, with Dow futures jumping over 1,000 points, S&P 500 futures rising more than 2%, and NASDAQ 100 futures climbing nearly 3%. Asian markets rallied as well, with Japan's Nikkei 225 closing up 5.4%, South Korea's Kospi rising 6.9%, and major tech companies posting gains. Treasury yields dropped as investors shifted out of safe haven assets, with the 1-0-year note hitting 4.247%, its lowest since mid-March. Yet the underlying crisis remains unresolved. Even with the ceasefire, analysts warned that the Strait of Hormuz may not fully reopen, keeping energy prices elevated. Over 2,000 ships remain stranded, with more than 800 trapped in the Persian Gulf. Clearing this backlog will take months, even if the ceasefire holds. Insurance issues persist, as war risk coverage was removed early in the conflict, making maritime operations economically risky. Iran has warned that failure of the ceasefire could lead to the closure of the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, threatening a quarter of global energy supply. The logistics nightmare, supply chain disruption, and economic fallout have only just begun. The next 14 days will be critical. Talks in Islamabad will attempt to resolve the future of the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions relief, U.S. military presence in the region, compensation for damages, nuclear issues, and regional proxy conflicts. Fundamental disagreements remain deep-rooted, and the risk of renewed conflict is ever present. Even if peace is achieved, the backlog of shipping, damaged infrastructure, and global economic disruption will continue for months. Ordinary citizens should not expect immediate relief at the gas pump. Gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel prices will likely continue to rise. Inflationary pressures are mounting globally, and recession risks remain elevated. On April 7th, the world came within 90 minutes of catastrophic escalation, potentially killing tens of thousands and triggering a wider war. Instead, a 2-week ceasefire was announced, a pause, a chance. The fundamental issues remain unresolved. Iran seeks control of the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions relief, withdrawal of U.S. forces, and compensation for destruction. The U.S. has not agreed to these demands. Israel remains skeptical. Analysts predict the war could continue into June. Thousands of people remain dead or wounded, cities destroyed, and trillions of dollars in economic damage incurred. Oil prices fell dramatically on ceasefire news, yet they remain 70% higher than pre-war levels. Gas and diesel prices will not fall anytime soon. This is not peace. This is a 1-4-day window. The coming 2 weeks will determine whether we see a negotiated settlement or whether the threats that nearly destroyed a civilization become reality. The global economy, energy markets, and millions of lives hang in the balance. Islamabad will be the center of attention. The Strait of Hormuz will be watched closely. Oil markets will reflect every shift in negotiations. The next 14 days are decisive. This is the beginning, not the end, of a conflict that could define the world's economic and geopolitical trajectory for the remainder of 2026. As we move into the second week of this 2-week ceasefire, the world watches with bated breath. The Strait of Hormuz, the lifeline of global energy, remains partially open, but under Iranian military coordination, that simple statement masks a tangle of unresolved strategic, economic, and geopolitical complexities. While markets have rallied on hope, the reality is that hope is a fragile currency. The backlog of over 2,000 ships stranded in the Persian Gulf cannot simply vanish overnight. Ports are overwhelmed, cranes and terminals are operating at reduced capacity, and production lines across multiple continents have been halted because storage facilities are full. Even if every ship were allowed to sail immediately, it would take months to restore pre-war supply chains. This is not a theoretical problem. Every delay, every bottleneck, every disrupted shipment directly impacts fuel prices, fertilizer availability, food security, and industrial production worldwide. Meanwhile, the political negotiations in Islamabad are progressing, but slowly. On Friday, April 10th, delegations from the United States and Iran sat down with Pakistani mediators. The agenda was straightforward in theory, but impossible in practice. The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz under mutually acceptable terms, the easing of sanctions, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, compensation for war damages, limits on Iran's nuclear program, and the future of Iranian-backed proxy forces in the region. In reality, each side arrived with maximalist positions. Iran insists on military oversight of shipping, full compensation, and the lifting of decades of sanctions. The United States demands unrestricted maritime passage, verifiable limits on nuclear enrichment, and a continuing U.S. presence to guarantee regional security. Even small differences, such as the coordination of port traffic and insurance guarantees for vessels, have become points of intense debate. The human cost continues to mount. Casualty reports trickle in daily. Civilians who survived initial bombardments face shortages of electricity, clean water, and medical supplies. Hospitals struggle with inadequate staffing and damaged infrastructure. In Israel, missile and drone attacks remain intermittent, testing air defense systems and keeping the population on edge. In Lebanon, sporadic clashes between Israeli forces and Hezbollah continue despite the ceasefire. The war's ripple effects are global, with energy markets, food prices, and geopolitical tensions all remaining in a state of acute volatility. Even as diplomats negotiate, the threat of renewed escalation looms. Iranian officials have repeatedly warned that any deviation from the ceasefire would trigger immediate retaliation, not just in the Persian Gulf, but potentially in the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This would further disrupt a quarter of the world's energy supply. The United States has kept its military posture ready, signaling that it will respond forcefully if the ceasefire is violated. Both sides understand that these 14 days are not merely a pause. They are a test of political will, strategic restraint, and global patience. Economic analysts are clear. The ceasefire is temporary, and the underlying energy crisis has not been resolved. Patrick Don of GasBuddy warns that fuel prices are unlikely to decline significantly until full reopening of the strait occurs and supply chains recover. The International Energy Agency has confirmed that global shipping and oil production remain below pre-war levels. and that the consequences of the Persian Gulf disruptions will reverberate throughout 2026. Inflationary pressures are rising, and many economies face the dual threats of higher energy costs and supply chain instability. Consumer prices, fertilizer costs, and industrial production are all vulnerable to further escalation or even minor delays in the reopening of the strait. Geopolitically, the ceasefire exposes the fragility of alliances and the difficulty of negotiation under extreme pressure. Israel is cautiously supportive, but insists on protecting its national security interests in Lebanon. Pakistan has emerged as a critical mediator, leveraging its unique relationships with both Washington and Tehran. China and other global powers have voiced support for mediation efforts, but are urging caution, aware that any misstep could lead to broader conflict. Analysts note that the ceasefire is a test not just of Iran and the United States, but of the international community's ability to prevent escalation in an era of rapid, interconnected global risk. As the 14 days draw to a close, two scenarios dominate the horizon. In the first, negotiations succeed. Iran and the United States reach an agreement that guarantees at least temporary unrestricted passage through the Strait of Hormuz, limits hostilities by regional proxies, and establishes a framework for phased sanctions relief. The backlog of shipping begins to clear, markets stabilize, and the global economy starts to recover from the shock of the war. Even in this scenario, the damage done, trillions of dollars in losses, thousands of dead and wounded, cities and infrastructure destroyed, cannot be undone overnight. The economic and human costs will linger for years. The second scenario is darker. Negotiations stall or collapse entirely. Iran maintains control over the strait, continuing to limit shipping and keeping energy markets in turmoil. U.S. forces remain poised to respond, and tensions escalate again, potentially leading to renewed bombardment. Proxy conflicts in Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere flare up, and the global economy faces further disruption. Oil prices could spike once more, inflation could worsen, and global supply chains could face additional paralysis. In this scenario, the events of April 7th, Trump's threats, the human chains in Iran, and the last-minute ceasefire would not be remembered as a pause, but as the prelude to an even more catastrophic conflict. For ordinary people, the implications are immediate and tangible. Gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel prices are unlikely to drop soon. Food costs already affected by supply chain disruptions and fertilizer shortages may continue to rise. Energy security remains precarious. Even as political leaders negotiate, the risk of escalation or renewed disruption looms over every industry, every household, and every economy dependent on uninterrupted access to Middle Eastern energy. The lessons of this crisis are stark. A single decision by a political leader, a single tweet, can trigger global panic. Infrastructure, energy markets, and human lives are all intertwined in ways that make any unilateral action fraught with risk. The next 14 days are a test not only of diplomacy, but of global patience, strategic foresight, and the capacity to manage crises that have no easy solutions. What happens in Islamabad will ripple far beyond the negotiating table, affecting oil prices, stock markets, global supply chains, and the daily lives of millions around the world. As we conclude this analysis, it is essential to recognize that the ceasefire is a temporary pause, not a resolution. The threats that nearly escalated into catastrophic war remain on the table. Iran retains significant leverage, and the United States must balance deterrence with diplomacy. The world has been given a window, a fragile, precious opportunity to avoid the unthinkable. Whether peace or renewed conflict follows depends on the strategic choices made in the coming days. For viewers watching from around the world, the message is clear. Remain informed, remain vigilant, and understand that the headlines, market reactions, and political statements are only part of the story. The deeper dynamics, supply chain disruptions, human costs, and geopolitical complexities will shape the coming months. The next 14 days may well determine whether this conflict fades into history as a near catastrophe avoided or escalates into something far worse. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand the crisis, please like and subscribe. I will continue to track developments as they unfold, providing detailed updates on the Strait of Hormuz, the negotiations in Islamabad, and the implications for global energy and markets. Remember, this is not the end. It is the most critical 2-week period the world has seen in decades.